My name is Erin. Okay, we're being recorded now. Perfect. So I'll start again. Good afternoon. My name is Erin Carrison, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. And I am so pleased to introduce our first speaker and have a really productive conversation with you all about bad apple policing and what to do about it. So our guest is coming to us to participate in the Institute for Government Studies colloquium, and it's a series titled Race and Ethnicity and Immigration. And this is a series that brings speakers who ask really important questions about constructs of race, racial discrimination, ethnicity, and sort of the local issues that arise. So in the East Bay, in California, but also nationwide. And doing that through empirical analysis and critical analysis, and people who are really committed to public scholarship. So doing work like this, right? Engaging folks across disciplines, practices, and advocacy agendas. So we're very, very excited to kick off this year's colloquium with Dr. Rashawn Ray. And I'm going to briefly read his bio. I have to read it because it's so impressive. Dr. Rashawn Ray is the David N. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution, as well as a professor of sociology and the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland in College Park. He is also one of the co-editors of Context Magazine, Sociology for the Public, i.e. the Public Scholarship Commitment. And formerly, he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California-Berkeley. So in some sense, he's coming home to us briefly for an hour or so. Dr. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Dr. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, as well as over 20 op-eds. His articles have appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, Science Advances, Social Science Research, Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Du Bois Review, and the Annual Review of Public Health. Most recently, he published the book, How Families Matter, Simply Complicated Intersections of Race, Gender, and Work, as well as an edition of Race and Ethnic Relations in the 21st Century, History, Theory, Institutions, and Policy, which has been adopted nearly 40 times in college courses across the nation. So with that, I'm very, very excited to hear remarks from Dr. Ray, and specifically about how bad apples come from rotten trees in policing, the pursuit of racial equality. Welcome, Dr. Ray.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I mean, as you were saying, for me, it's really like coming back home to Berkeley in a sense. As I was saying beforehand, I did an RWJ postdoc at Berkeley. My kids were born in Oakland at the Kaiser in Oakland. So it's definitely home. I would much rather be in person because we had planned this in the spring, obviously, but I'm super excited to be talking right now during this pivotal moment. And so thanks everyone for coming. I also see some of my students from University of Maryland, including Robin Moore. So thank you all for being here. So definitely look forward to this conversation. So I'm gonna share my screen and then we will get moving.
I'm gonna go on mute, Rashawn. If you need anything, I'm here, but I'm going on mute.
Okay. You all can see my screen, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to get through this in 40 minutes, and then we're going to have a very, very extended Q&A, and I look forward to that. So one of the things that I've been highlighting in my work is that bad apples come from rotten trees in policing. And I've been doing this work for about a decade, and I'll kind of build up how I got to this point. But what started it for me was some of my work while I was at Berkeley. And what I essentially discovered in my research on physical activity was an Ahmaud Arbery outcome. I discovered in my work that Black men were overly criminalized. Their Blackness became weaponized in predominantly white neighborhoods. Of course, this happened multiple times, but Ahmaud Arbery is one of the most recent and public. And so that was where the work started for me. From there, it spiraled to looking at policing. and wanting to deal with a key outcome that I'll highlight in a second. But obviously, one of the things that we know is that we are here because of what happened to George Floyd in a sense, but so many others that we could highlight. But I think this image really encapsulates where we are as a nation and really where we are as a global community in terms of dealing with policing, not just in the United States, but in other places around the world. Because one of the things we know, even though other countries don't necessarily have the same level of gun violence that we do in the United States, particularly because of the Second Amendment and the like, they still have racial disparities when it comes to policing. Now, if you look at this image, captured 50 years apart, one of the things that's interesting about it is that outside of one being in color, one being black and white, you really can't see the differences between those. And I have this highlighted in 2014 because this was the moment for me where we really started collecting a lot of data at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. But obviously we could take an image from 2020 and see the exact same thing.
You're muted.
All right, I'm good now. All right. And so obviously when we look at images like this, the one down on the bottom on the left has become more commonplace since I've been doing this work. I don't think anyone is surprised by this image, but about 5 years ago, people were. We see the image on the top right, and supposedly this is the image that law enforcement aims to highlight for us. But what we have right now at this moment is a policy window. The way I think about a policy window is like a match being lit. You know, when you light a match, you're about to light a candle, and you have a certain amount of time to get that match on the wick before the match goes out. That's the moment we are in right now as it relates to policing. And hopefully we'll get to a discussion about what that looks like. I think I have a nuanced perspective on what policy change looks like, primarily through the work that I've been doing at the Brookings Institution. But we know that there is a long line from thinking about the end of slavery, thinking about convict leasing, the civil rights movement, the Great Depression, where we've had these social movements, right? The women's rights movement, when we think about other sorts of movements for marriage equality and the like, the gun movement, these have been massive forms where we see large whole-scale change. And I think we're in this moment as it relates to policing. So what I'm going to highlight for you over the next 35 minutes or so is a lot of data that we've collected over the years, including a large data set using tweets, 32 million tweets from a year in the life of Ferguson, ethnographic observations with implicit bias trainings with about 1,200 police officers, interviews with police officers and civilians, and then our virtual reality work, which I'll get to and highlight some of the findings that I'll be able to show from there. So I'm going to aim to get through 7 things. Okay, this is giving you a roadmap. I'm going to talk about the evolution of Black Lives Matter. We're going to racialize the criminal justice system. I'm going to speed through both of those because I think for the most part, people are now up to speed based on what we've seen this year. And talk about the social psychology of criminalization, police views of Black Lives Matter, which is really interesting, civilian views of police interactions, and then our virtual reality work with police officers, then ending with policy. So of course, most people think about Black Lives Matter starting with Michael Brown. However, it didn't necessarily start with Michael Brown. It actually started with Trayvon Martin. And 3 Black queer women came together and started saying on Facebook that Black lives don't matter. And eventually one of them responded and said, Black lives do matter. And we had the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement. But it is true that the Black Lives Matter movement really flourished after Michael Brown was killed. And I'll get to that in a second, with Michael Brown, with Freddie Gray, with Corinne Gaines, with Sandra Bland, with a series of others that we know mattered. But one of the things that I have a question about, and typically in person it becomes really interesting to look at this, is that most people don't know that Trayvon Martin's family was awarded $1 million from the Homeowners Association. This is an example of a civilian payout for misconduct. That even though George Zimmerman was found not guilty, and I think most people think he was guilty, I definitely think he was, that still did not mean that he would not, that the homeowners association wouldn't have to pay for Trayvon's death, his murder, actually. This pattern is very similar to what we see in policing more broadly. And we can think about a series of different types of payouts, from Walter Scott on the top right to Freddie Gray on the right in the middle, Alton Sterling, Sandra Bland, Corinne Gaines, Philando Castile. Well, one of the incidents that you may not know about, and look at Corinne Gaines. Most of you probably haven't heard of her story, but you should. And hopefully after this, you'll look it up. She had been saying that she was being accosted by Baltimore police. And based on a Department of Justice consent decree, she was probably correct, because there were a lot of Black people living in Baltimore who were being overly policed by Baltimore Police Department. Has a lot of corruption. It's one of the most corrupt police departments that I've been able to research and study. But Corinne Gaines said that she had been being followed and stopped for no reason. They had a bench warrant for her arrest for failure to appear for being stopped. They came to her house. After a standoff of a few hours, police busted up in her house, shot and killed her while she was holding her 4-year-old son in her hands. Corinne Gaines did have a gun that I think was legally owned. And because of that incident, I remember reading the Baltimore Sun. And the next week it said, son of Corinne Gaines expected to make a full recovery. And I thought to myself, I said, wow, what world are we living in where a 4-year-old is being held by his mother and is shot and killed? His mother is shot and killed by police, and he is shot by police. And we expect for him to make a full recovery. Even if his physical wounds heal, the mental and emotional scars never will. And this speaks to some of the outcomes as it relates to what it means to be Black in America. Interestingly, this case not only is one of the largest civilian payouts for police misconduct in American history, it is way back and forth where the money was allocated. Then a judge ruled that the city of Baltimore didn't have enough money to pay it. And then all of a sudden, a recent judge ruled that they would have to pay the money. These type of incidents happen across the country. And what I want you to think about, if you know anything about Baltimore like I do, is that Baltimore, imagine if this money went toward education and work infrastructure. Now, not saying that Corinne Gaines' family shouldn't be awarded that money, but the way that we have to think about this is that these civilian payouts that you see here, including a host of others, such as Tamir Rice, 12-year-old playing with a toy gun in Cleveland, that all of these monies come from taxpayer money in these municipalities, in these cities. So that means George Floyd's family, that means Jacob Blake's family, that means Breonna Taylor's family, all of them are going to eventually get a large civil payout. And their families' taxpayer money is going to be used to pay them back for the dehumanization and murder of their loved one. And overwhelmingly, outside of what's happening now with George Floyd, we'll see about the other incidents, that is the only incident where officers have been charged. Over 95% of the time, officers are never charged for the people who they kill, despite the fact that millions and millions of dollars are paid out in civilian payouts. How much money? Well, let's take Laquan McDonald. That's just $5 million for the fact that they shot this boy in the back while he was running away, having some sort of mental health episode. Now, the officer did get fired, did get charged in that incident, but the city of Chicago has spent over $650 million in civil settlements for police misconduct over the past 2 decades, $650 million. The city of New York has spent almost $100 million in 1 year alone, going from 2017 to 2018. These are the types of outcomes that we're talking about. That all of a sudden people aren't held liable for these types of things. And part of it has to do with qualified immunity, but not entirely, because qualified immunity speaks to civil culpability, whether or not a person can be sued financially for taking someone's life or injuring them. However, the courts, including judges, prosecutors, and juries, oftentimes interpret qualified immunity as being something that applies to criminal proceedings for law enforcement, even though that's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's several others. The list will go on and on. Eric Gardner, of course, I Can't Breathe. That is where that really started. Jonathan Ferrell, if you don't know about that incident, look it up. Tragic incident. He had some type of vehicle problem, and then all of a sudden he stops, tries to ask for help. Person calls the police on him. Police show up, shoot and kill him. Oscar Grant, of course, right down the road from Berkeley in Oakland. I remember we got to Oakland right after Oscar Grant was killed, and the sentencing came down right while we were there. So these types of incidents are oftentimes in our backyard. We also know from the work that one of my colleagues, Ali Sewell at Emory University, has led, that we recently published in Ethnic and Racial Studies with a slew of other notable scholars that you can see on the top left, that police killings don't only impact the health or the life of the person who was killed, but it also impacts their families and their communities. One of the things we found is that men living in neighborhoods with high levels of police violence, controlling for all other things, including crime, that those men suffer, their mental health suffers. We also know that women who live in those neighborhoods, their physical health suffers. They are more likely to be obese, more likely to be diagnosed with high blood pressure. And in this regard, the image that you see on the right is actually Eric Garner's daughter, who died a few years after him from what we consider to be the collateral consequences of police killings, and how health ends up having an illness spillover from the lethal forms of police violence. So let's talk about the criminal justice system. Well, one of the things we know, and even though these data are dated, these patterns still exist. If you look on the left, this is people who were stopped in 2002, 2005. On the right, that's the people who were searched. There's one line that doesn't look like the others. That's the green lines. See, oftentimes we like to frame policing as Blacks and Latinos being overly policed. That's true. But in some regard, it might actually be that white people might be under-policed, that we see a white preference in regards to what's going on. So even though people are pulled over at similar rates, even though Blacks and Latinos are more likely to be pulled over overall, that we also see, though, that whites are significantly less likely to be searched. Even though we know that when it comes to drugs, that there really aren't racial differences in the rate of people who uses drugs and is also distributing them. We also know that people are overly policed when it comes to stop and frisk. This is data from New York City. What this data looked at was from the year 2011, nearly 700,000 police stops, as you see here. And then you can look at the percentage of stops that involve frisking, meaning being frisked up. This is what's interesting about it. This is the percentage of people who were stopped by race. Half of those were Black, a third were Latino. This is the key point. Look how much force was used. You see disparities, Blacks, Latinos, whites. But this is the kicker. Only 2% of the time did the stops lead to the discovery of contraband or people who had a previous criminal record and who were arrested. 88% of the stops led to nothing, 6% led to a summons, and 6% of the stops resulted in arrest, particularly for resisting arrest. Yeah, you think if you're pulled over or stopped on the street for something that you don't think you should be, you're gonna probably have something to say about that. This is the big thing though. Here comes the outcome that everybody's focused on, because I've built up the other outcomes that lead to this outcome. Some people say, well, justifiable homicides or death by legal intervention or police killings, these are all similar terms depending on who you're talking to, that is not a whole lot of people that this impacts. Well, I want you to look at this graph. This is justifiable homicides. How many homicides are ruled as justifiable from law enforcement? Now, in any given year, police officers kill over 1,000 people, and every 40 hours, a Black person is killed by police. So these are only half of the deaths by police, at least what we know about it. We know how many people get killed by jellyfish every year. The CDC collects it. But the CDC does not collect data on how many people are killed by the police. That should unnerve us all. But of the ones that are ruled justifiable, we've seen a huge uptick. It's decreased a little bit, but more or less still higher than the 90 numbers. And this is what's interesting about the 90s. For those of us who were living through the 70s and 80s and early 90s, the crime rate was really high then. We have to ask ourselves, why when the crime rate was really high and we started seeing policy changes as it relates to policing, that justifiable homicides decreased? Look at this. This is violent crime. In the 1990s, violent crime started plummeting. So the fact that these justifiable homicides have increased through the 2000s suggests, and into the 2010s and to the present, suggests that this isn't about crime, or else we will see a different pattern. The other thing we know is that social class doesn't mean a whole lot. This is the racial gap in police killings. What you see here, these two bars are blacks. These two bars are whites. The red lines are people who are more affluent. The teal lines are people who are less affluent. This spike that you're seeing here, these are our civil rights leaders who were being killed in the 60s. And even though that's significantly reduced, we still have a racial gap. So this is dealing with people who say, oh, well, the people who are really killed by the police are low-income people. These are low-income Black people living in urban areas. They're in places where crime is just more likely to happen. So this is a collateral consequence of this. Now, this graph actually shows something different. It shows that it's not about class. It's about race. It's about race. And Blacks are still much more likely to be killed by police. We also know that if they get arrested for a crime, that there are differences in the way Black people and white people are treated in the criminal justice system. That if there are no Black people in the jury pool, we see huge disparities between Blacks and whites and who's found guilty for the same types of crimes. But when there's at least one Black person in the jury pool, it's a non-significant outcome. Obviously, you all probably know from Diva Page's work that once people are released from prison, then we also see disparities, but race still trumps it. Not only are whites without a criminal record more likely to get called back and hired than Blacks, but whites with the criminal record are more likely to get called back and hired than Blacks without a criminal record. This is race in America, and it's specifically racism. We know that there have been huge shifts in attitudes, but even starting in 2016, as much as we focus on this racial awakening now with George Floyd, it was already building. If you look here, in 2016, over 50% of white people 4 years ago were saying that, the way police interact with Black people, there's something else going on there. This percentage has increased, but this is just telling you that the Black Lives Matter movement has done a good job of mobilizing people, particularly white people, to be motivated about dealing with policing. This has been an overtime trend that we've seen. And part of this is thinking about how we think about the social psychology of policing. Implicit bias is a term that people talk about. Of course, implicit bias is simply our mind's way of making sense of interactions that we have quickly. And these implicit biases can be deadly for citizens as well as police officers. They really stem from stereotypes about Black people that include 4 types of characteristics: intellectual ability, physical ability, propensity to commit crime, and emotional well-being. I think this study really highlights this really, really well. There was a study that looked at it. You all don't have to raise your hands. I can't see you, but you can just think about, for some of you, you just have a visceral reaction to seeing snakes and spiders. I mean, particularly snakes and spiders that look like this. Well, there are some people who have the same visceral reaction to snakes and spiders as they do to being in close proximity to Black men, like in an elevator. It doesn't matter what they have on. And I've experienced these type of incidents, even on college campuses. And then I want you to look at some images. Look at this image. Imagine if he was Black. Well, what do we think the outcome would have been? Because, see, this is the thing about policing. Again, we focus on the deleterious outcomes for Black people. But what I've learned studying policing is that it's the white preference on the other side that leads to a different level of policing if you're white. It leads to basically the same sort of incident. So what happened to Jacob Blake in Kenosha? There have been videos circulating of similar incidents of white men behaving similarly, actually even more belligerent, more violent. One beat up a police officer, took the police officer's police cruiser and started driving away. Not one bullet was fired. Jacob Blake, with his 3 sons in the car, shot 7 times in the back. This was another interesting incident. You all may or may have not heard about it in Florida. The man lying down on the ground with his hands up was shot by a police officer who was on the right side outside of view, who was hiding behind a pole. The man sitting there Indian style is the person who the man laying back, he was his caregiver. So the man Indian style was a person who had ran away from a group home, and his caretaker, who had got shot by the police, was coming to try to get him back to help him. He was unarmed, didn't have a weapon. When he yelled out and said, "Why did you shoot me?" the police officer said, "I don't know." That's what implicit bias does. And this is the bottom line. Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking or have a weapon. That's the group who we're talking about. We're not exactly talking about people who did something, even though I don't necessarily think they should be killed either. But the disparity, and where do these data come from? These data come from police officers themselves. But yet and still, there are only about 40% of law enforcement agencies who report this information. Only about 40% that report this information. And so part of this, we have to think about this in this regard, that we still don't have complete data. But of the data we had that is submitted from law enforcement, police officers say, were Black people attacking you? Nope. Did they have a weapon? Nope. They were still killed. 3.5 times more likely than whites are Black people to be killed than whites when they're not attacking or have a weapon. That is the key stat to highlight when we're walking through some of these data. So I want to shift to the way that social media was used in this moment, and it still continued to this day. We collected a large data set. As a matter of fact, Dr. Melissa Brown, who is a postdoc at the Clayman Institute at Stanford, was one of my PhD students in Maryland. She helped lead this project as well, along with some humanists, Neil Freystadt and Ed Summers. So it was a social science humanities merger where they were curating data, and we helped to analyze it and code it. We ended up publishing a special issue in Ethic and Racial Studies. Melissa Brown, Sanaa Laybourne, who's at the University of Memphis, and myself, we were the editors, and we solicited papers, and you all can search that special issue because it uses all social media data. But we collected these data, and you see some of the things here. I mean, I can go through all the details, but we collected it in 4 primary data points. When Michael Brown was killed, when Darren Wilson was not indicted for killing Michael Brown, that really sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. And then the Department of Justice report on Ferguson that handed down a consent decree showing that Ferguson was engaging in egregious forms of racial discrimination against Black motorists. And then 1 year after his death, these are some of the popular images. You all could just look through these. This is the spark. This is when people started really knowing about Black Lives Matter. It was the day that Darren Wilson wasn't indicted. What's great about these data is we can map it. So these are a number of tweets. Look at this. These are tweets that use the term Black Lives Matter. Look at this. Spike. It instantly became a thing. And it's fascinating as a scientist and a researcher for us to be able to document this. These were the more than all of these protests around the country. You all can see where you all are. You can see where I am outside of DC. We're all part of this. And this didn't get eclipsed until the women's rights movement. And then that was eclipsed again more recently with what happened with George Floyd. So we are in a social movement. That's what this is. And this is the thing. This is the evolution of Black Lives Matter. At the time of Michael Brown's death, it didn't even register. Top 10, top 20, most used hashtags about Ferguson. It didn't even register. But by the time Wilson wasn't indicted, it was number 3, only behind Michael Brown and Mike Brown. And then 1 year after his death. These were some of the themes that came from tweets that used Black Lives Matter. Blacks killed with impunity and whites not. And you all have continued to see these images, right? Where it's a group of Black people who were killed by the police who did not kill anyone. And then white people who killed a lot of people who were not killed by the police and who were apprehended safely. Black Lives Matter also aimed to highlight displays of activism. This was a good one. Telling me that I'm obsessed with talking about racism in America is like telling me I'm obsessed with swimming when I'm drowning. Pretty telling quote. And then, of course, a lot of displays of activism all across not only the United States, from Chicago to DC to New York, but also internationally, London and Toronto. But for every narrative, there is a counter narrative. This is one that you all probably haven't heard of, but you know what they do. It's called TCOT, Top Conservatives on Twitter. We started seeing this pop up in our data, and we were like, what the heck is this? We thought it was just, honestly, we didn't know what it was until it kept popping up. And we searched it, and what we found out is that TCOT takes credit for starting the Tea Party. They take credit for revitalizing the alt-right, and they take credit for firmly cementing the Tea Party into the Republican Party. I want you to think about this. I do work on Capitol Hill. Republicans, similar to Democrats, are really diverse in terms of what they think, in terms of where they come from. Not diverse in terms of race, not that diverse in terms of gender. But outside of that, some of their ideologies actually are a bit diverse, and they get lumped together. Part of it is because they folded. The Tea Party should have been its own thing, but they incorporated into the Republican Party so that they didn't use a generation. And now they are co-opted in what's going on. And this is why you need to know about TCOT. TCOT was more popular than Black Lives Matter in two of the 4 time periods we looked at. When the Department of Justice report came out, TCOT flooded Twitter to ensure that they were able to craft a narrative about what was happening. And we continue to see these patterns today. What are some of the things they highlight? Well, one is called validating justifiable homicides. This tweet says, according to Darren Wilson, this is what happened. No reason not to believe in Ferguson decision, Ferguson TCOT. That monster-like thing is supposed to be Michael Brown. That little bitty stick figure is supposed to be Officer Darren Wilson. Mind you, they actually have the height correctly, that both men are 6'4". It might be difficult for you all to see since you're on the screen, but both men are 6'4". Both of these were big men. But it's interesting how they frame it. Why did they say this? Because Darren Wilson said on a stand that Michael Brown looked like Hulk Hogan and he felt like a 5-year-old. And then he said Michael Brown looked like a demon. Oh, you start demonizing black men, you're going to probably get off, particularly if you're a police officer, and that's what he did. But see, there's a pattern here. He was told to say that the Fraternal Order of Police will oftentimes coach police officers who have been accused of misconduct, tell them that they fear for their life, and in a lot of states, fearing for your life as a police officer or a normal person even in a stand your ground state, you then have the ability to defend yourself. And there is one main stereotypical trope that continues to highlight itself, and that is the vilification and weaponization of blackness, particularly if you're a black man, but also if you're a black woman. We've seen this recently with Christian Cooper in New York City in Central Park. Amy Cooper knew that all she had to do was say that there was a black man after her, and police will come and be more likely to believe her over him. We have to ask ourselves, imagine if we didn't have video evidence of what happened with Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper. Imagine if we didn't have video evidence of Ahmaud Arbery. Imagine if we didn't have video evidence of George Floyd. Imagine if we didn't have video evidence of Jacob Blake and so many others. We have to ask ourselves, will we even be here now? We have to be realistic and ask ourselves, if those officers who killed Breonna Taylor, if they had body-worn camera footage on, how much more will we know? Would more of those officers have been fired? Would they actually be facing charges? And then we have to ask ourselves, why we always need video evidence to prove black innocence or to prove police officer culpability. TCOT also highlights Black Lives Matter as radical terrorists, essentially saying that, oh, if they take over, this is the world we're going to see. And we have to think about how this same narrative is couched in some of the things that Trump is doing to this day. So what do police officers think about Black Lives Matter? Well, here you go. Overwhelmingly, officers say that Black Lives Matter is negative. And I want you all to look at this green bar. This green bar are black officers who have over 7 years of experience. See, just let me debunk this real quick. One perception that the media plays out and that people think is that some kind of way it's only white officers who behave this way. Our research overwhelmingly suggests that's not the case. White officers are not the only ones who behave this way, nor are they the only ones who think this way. And I'm going to give you all 3 data points. This is the first one about police officers. Overwhelmingly, officers have negative views of Black Lives Matter. But there is a slight difference, and this one is pretty interesting, that 80% of white officers with at least 7 years of experience, and we're still coding some of these data, but of the data that we coded, 80% of officers with over 7 years of experience say that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group. This tells you where we are. I'll just skip straight to this top one. You can read this. I think Black Lives Matter is, in my opinion, it's a domestic terrorist organization, just like the KKK. I bet you know, and they're hell-bent on seeing the U.S. burn. This is what police officers think about Black Lives Matter. And now they're trying to sort through it because it's been so many white people at Black Lives Matter protests, they're trying to think about what that means now. But it still doesn't mean that it's changed their view, particularly in the spinning of Antifa and kind of what they're doing. It gives them a far left view of some of these things that come out. We conducted a large study with body-worn cameras with police officers or with police officers and civilians. This is what we found. We found that when it came to body-worn cameras, people fell into 4 groups. 2 that are supporters of body-worn cameras, 2 that are skeptics. The supporters of body-worn cameras are policing supporters. These are people who say, you know what, police officers get treated badly every single day, and body-worn cameras are going to show that. And then you have citizen supporters who actually say the same thing, but from an opposite view. They say police officers treat people badly every single day, and body-worn cameras are going to highlight it. You know what I call this? This is a recipe for policy change, because 2 people on opposite ends of the spectrum think the same thing. They think the solution is body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras are not the solution. Body-worn cameras simply highlights what is oftentimes happening in plain sight, but oftentimes not recorded. So it's important for transparency. But body-worn cameras are not a panacea, similar to implicit bias trainings. I'll get to that in a second. But then we have skeptics of body-worn cameras. Policing skeptics are people who say, you know what? Body-worn cameras can't show everything. I mean, police officers, they get hit from behind. Something might have happened before the video. These are people who are talking about Jacob Blake. So now when people are like, well, something happened before that. You know, my perspective is I don't know exactly what happened before that. In some sense, I don't even care. All I know is that a police officer shot a man in the back while he was leaning into the car with his kids in the car, shot this man in the back 7 times while he was pulling on his white t-shirt. And then there's structural skeptics. These are people who say, you know what? We had dash cameras after Rodney King got killed in the 90s, or got beat up in the 90s. And you know what? That didn't change anything. After Amadou Diallo got killed, that didn't change anything. So these are the categories of people. I want to quickly talk about 3 more things. First is defund the police. I wrote a piece at Brookings called, What is Defund the Police and Does It Have Merit? Well, yes, it does have merit. And essentially what defund the police is really about reallocating funding. There are definitely some people who say defund the police is about abolishing the police. Most people put them in a different category. You have abolishing the police. One group of people say we just shouldn't have law enforcement at all. There are another group of people who want the rotten trees, as I call them, to be dug up. For anybody who gardens, who you know that the roots are typically 2 to 3 times as strong, deep, and wide as the tree that we see above ground. In order to deal with policing, we have to deal with the roots of policing, because when we go back to the beginning of policing in America has roots in slave patrols. Part of highlighting slave patrols is that these were people who would go around and aim to get slaves who had fled the plantation back to the plantation. See, part of the narrative we have is that Black people were just kind of complicit or going along with this, and that's not the case. If you haven't seen Harriet's, I suggest you do. There were so many Black people fighting, resisting on a regular basis, and then there were people who would go try to find them. And most of them were white, but you know what? They would also pay and recruit some Black people to do that too. So the legacy of that is very, very similar. Simply because a person has Black skin or looks like you doesn't always mean they are for you or down for you or the protection of your body. And that is something that we really, really have to disentangle and interrogate. So defund the police does have merits when we look at it. Calls for service are a problem. 9 out of 10 are for nonviolent calls. The homicide clearance rate is abhorrent. About 40% of murders go unsolved every single year. And then if you really want to deal with crime, you invest in education and work infrastructure, not more policing. Response times are also a problem. In Black and Latino communities, people wait longer, several minutes longer for police officers to respond. And despite what people think, there are fewer officers assigned to minority districts in the case of emergency. This is the reason why people are more likely to die before they get to the hospital, because of these response times. When we look at funding, we can see across the board, Oakland being one of them. Oakland actually spends the most out of any city on policing. This is out of general funds. I want you all to think about this. If we look at Oakland, that means every $4 out of $10 are spent on policing. Every 40 cents out of every dollar is spent on policing. And in a lot of cities, every $1 out of $3 are spent on policing. And we have to ask ourselves, are we actually getting the return on that? This is Oakland. This was in 2017. You can see how much the police department gets compared to other things. Parks and recreation. And look, some of the parks in Oakland are amazing. I mean, I lived in Lake Merritt when I was there, and this is an amazing space. Of course, when people aren't having a police call on them for trying to cook out, which is what everybody does in Lake Merritt. But besides that point, you can look at how little social services are getting. So when people are saying defund the police, what they are saying is that we need to reallocate funding to these other social services, and potentially there are other social services that should be responding to mental health calls, addiction calls, dealing with traffic calls, like some of the things that's happening in Berkeley. Oh, and then when we look at training, look at how little money goes to community outreach. This is in Dallas. Look how little money goes to in-service training relative to other types of things in a police department. And what's interesting there is that police officers receive about 50 hours of firearm training when they're coming through the police academy, but less than 10 hours of de-escalation training. So we wonder why they pull their gun when they show up at a scene. It's because that's what they've been trained to do. Part of thinking through this isn't only about reallocating, though. My research also suggests reinvesting in the community. That's what Congresswoman Karen Bass always highlights, who is also from California, who is over the Congressional Black Caucus. She says, rather than thinking about defund, maybe we think about reinvesting in the community. Because oftentimes, predominantly white neighborhoods have more of a balance in some of these things and the way funding is. But also think about shifting funding within law enforcement to help them improve their service. I'm gonna quickly talk about our virtual reality program that we've done. We developed a virtual reality program at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research with computer scientists. And what we did was we first started out with implicit bias trainings with police officers. Now we do these on the back end. When we first collected data with police officers, we had them do implicit association tests. And what we found was truly shocking. This was the results from a large recruit class who are now mostly police officers. These data are now a few years old. There's not a mistake in these data. What you see, these implicit association tests, if you've taken them, that you can either have a preference one way, a preference or another way, or be neutral. Overwhelmingly, police officers had a preference for Blacks with weapons, meaning they associated weapons more with Black people. No police officers had a strong or moderate preference for whites with weapons, despite the fact that whites relative to Blacks are more likely to own guns and use guns on a regular basis. These police officers were diverse across race. They were also diverse by gender. This isn't just a white officer thing. It's not even really just an officer thing. It is a socialization thing about the way we view Blackness and the stereotypes we associate with it. So what have we done? We developed a series of virtual reality scenarios, over 90 of them, that varied the skin tone of the person who police officers encountered, varied whether or not the setting was in an urban environment or suburban environment. And then we had escalation and de-escalation. The person acted agitated, hearing impaired, autistic, acted like they were high on PCP, and then had a series of things in their hands, a cell phone, a knife, or a gun. We also had pullover scenes. We varied the gender, we varied the race, we varied the language. I'm going to show you some of what we found, but just highlighting a couple of things. We would go out in suspicious person areas, urban settings, suburban settings, and we can track all of this information: heart rate, stress through speech, eye tracking, body movement, years on the force, all these demographic things. We can also capture their heart rate, which they wear with monitors. Stress through speech, we put their voices through a stress machine. We can tell you how stressed they are. Their body movement and weapon tracking. We put these little sensors that are like the size of quarters on replica weapons. And then we do eye tracking. So we can give them a host of tons of information about what is going on with them. And I want to quickly show you some of the findings that we have with them. Give me 1 second. Let me transition PowerPoints here.
This is so good.
I'm almost done. We about to get to questions. Give me 1 second. And so we had 3 main scenarios. In our new program, it's an algorithm that responds back to officers. And the settings are bus, house stop, convenience store. The main outcome you're going to see here is deference. Deference can best be captured by how respectful officers are to people. And one of the big patterns you see here, one big thing we found about policing is that the less ambiguous things are, the more respectful officers are. At a convenience store, officers interact with someone who is a store clerk. They have on a uniform. They have clearly been robbed. They're treated respectfully. When they come to a person's house, yeah, okay, the homeowner answers the door. They treat them with some sense of respect if they're just responding to a normal call, like a domestic dispute. But when you're at a bus stop, like they don't know what happened, they got a call that some people might have got to fighting and that someone has on a green hoodie, not a lot of respect there. This is the big thing though. We also see not only a racial gap, we also see an intersectional finding. This is the level of respect by race and gender. Black women received the least amount of respect from police officers. Police officers even respect Black men to a certain extent when they know the setting. So I'm about to get to this in a second. Look at this. When all of a sudden the setting is ambiguous, Black men and Black women are similar. The main finding here is that, first off, police officers treat Black women less respectfully. They view them as angry because the characters get angry. But when the white woman acts the same way, because the characters have the same voice, we just vary their skin tone. So in a classic experimental style, they are much less respectful to the Black woman and more respectful to the white woman. But when the setting is ambiguous, meaning officers don't have a lot of information, that's when we really see implicit bias on steroids. And at that juncture, that is where we see a lot of discrimination and a lot of problems. So this is the bottom line here. What do we need to do to deal with some of these outcomes? Well, essentially what we need to do here, let me share my screen one more time. What we need to do are a few things. First, we need to have a national database of bad apples. Tamir Rice might still be alive. George Floyd might still be alive. Others might still be alive if we had a national database. We also need protections for good officers. We need to reallocate funding. We also need to have civilian representation on trial boards. These are the internal boards that make decisions about misconduct within police departments. And then some other things that people might not necessarily think about. We need mandatory housing subsidies for police officers to live in the community, and they need mental health counseling. And then finally, my big one is we need to restructure civilian payouts for misconduct away from tax money into police department insurance policies. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. I learned so much. I studied policing and I was like, whoa, a bunch of times. Thank you so much for all of that. Really, really wonderful. We have a lot of questions, so I'm actually going to be really brief in my remarks, but I wanted to lift up a couple of things that came to mind when I was listening to you, Dr. Ray. The first of which, well, I should start by sort of reintroducing myself to everyone. I am an unapologetic carceral abolitionist. So when I think about defunding and reform and addressing a lot of the challenges that Dr. Ray just raised, I'm coming from a position where I'm like, burn it until it's dead. But I will entertain some discussion because it's not my talk. I'm sorry, my dog is making a cameo appearance. So a couple of things I wanted to lift up first was, what would it mean if we, instead of thinking about this as police brutality, instead thought about police terrorism, right? So a big part of this series, and our host, the Institute for Government Studies, thinks about how these behaviors, how these larger sort of macro structural dynamics shape racial life, identity, economic life, and capacity to engage in politics and sort of like a fullness of citizenship, things like that. Because when I was thinking about the narratives you shared in your slides, it's important, the language matters, right? And our government has a stand on terrorism, you know? So I just think about, what if we lifted up police presence and harassment and violence as terroristic? Because given all the health implications you listed, Dr. Ray, it's bigger than just direct contact. You know, there's a lot of fallout. So just thinking about that when we think about addressing these challenges. And I so appreciate that you noted that we can't, you know, diversify our way out of this. You know, there's always sort of the call for Black cops or Black leadership, mayors, and things like that. I was on the ground in Baltimore following Freddie Gray's murder, and I'm calling it a murder. And it was a mess with the mayor, you know, trying to negotiate with state's attorney. Like, these are Black people, you know, and these things are still happening on their watch. And the last thing that I want to lift up for us to think about when we start engaging these questions from our participants is the cost benefit analysis, if you will, or I should say, that's what I was thinking about. You were talking about the payouts, and this is millions and millions and millions of dollars. And I thought about the Ford Pinto. I don't know how many of you remember the Pinto. I'm 36, and I remember when that thing existed. And there was some sort of malfunction with the ignition, like something was happening by the gas tank, and it would lead to the car basically combusting randomly. And they knew this, right? And they didn't take the cars back, recall them, that's the word. They didn't recall the cars because they did like an actuarial analysis, if you will. And the likelihood of folks dying in this car that would literally explode, that likelihood and addressing it via civil suits and payouts cost less than recalling the car, right? So they literally did that math. And when I think about Black Lives Matter, and thinking about public budgets, which really follow the money, right? That's an indication of our public values. Nobody ever talks about the comptroller. I'm like, you need to see what city supervisors and things like that are doing. What is the value of our lives? You know, even with these payouts, are they cheaper than sort of the larger carceral engine that is so robust in this nation? You know, so as we think about reforms, we have to think also about, what are the values, like the material value that's assigned to Black life, and how do those metrics, stand in the face of material values that are prioritized, right, above Black life? So I'm going to stop there. Those are some things I was just thinking about. Dr. Ray, you may or may not address them. It doesn't matter. I just wanted to lift them up because I know we want to get to the participants. But those are some of the things I thought about, and I'm really, really grateful for your talk. So folks, you are welcome to add questions to the chat. I'm going to try and be very diligent. You see I put my goggles on, so I'm going to go into the chat. But first, I want to invite Dr. Ray to address some of the questions that were posted by registrants prior to joining us this afternoon. So let me just scoot to that.
Oh, Aaron, you should call me Rashawn, and let me respond to some of the stuff you said, what you just said. Yeah, we, don't pay attention to. Oh, okay, that's good. The doctor, that normally Google does the default. So look, I think, so there are a couple of things I think, and I'll be quick on this, but everything you just said was right on point. The first thing was talking about domestic terrorism. We have to be very clear to call police violence and police terror domestic terrorism. And there is a direct link to make. the Department of Homeland Security, despite the fact that Trump is coming out publicly talking about, we shouldn't have implicit bias trainings and all this sort of thing. Well, one thing people have to realize, I've been working with the Department of Homeland Security and the military for years. When Trump took office, that was something that started happening. So he just came out publicly and said this because he thinks it's going to be good for his base. He's trying to galvanize some people for the election, but this is something he's already been doing. People internally at the federal government are kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, that's not surprising. Might be some surprise to some contractors, but people who work directly with government agencies like I do aren't surprised. And to your point, we need to call it as such, that the Department of Homeland Security, despite what Trump is saying, came out with another report. They've had several since Trump has been in office, saying that white nationalism is the biggest threat to our democracy and our national security. We have to be very clear about that. And the big thing we have to be clear about is part of thinking about how bad apples come from rotten trees is that policing in America, that white nationalism and right-wing organizations have viewed law enforcement as an occupation to infiltrate. They always have. I talked about slave patrols, but there are other key points people should know. 1952 in Boston, the Emerald Society was founded. It's an organization of Irish firefighters and police officers. You got to think about the year at the beginning of the civil rights movement. It was founded as a way to preserve white heritage. Of course, they were talking about ethnicity and that sort of thing, but it really is based on the sort of things that we might think it is. And then we fast forward and the Department of Homeland Security talks about the way white nationalism are infiltrating law enforcement. In Louisiana, at the beginning of COVID, there was a police officer who got fired for posting on Facebook, I wish more black people, I can't believe more black people didn't die from COVID. We know down in Florida that there were 2 police officers who got caught going to a KKK meeting. There are others. Part of the way we think about this is that the culture of policing also has to be dealt with in addition to the structural organization of it. So particularly within the Fraternal Order of Police, we see the ways that these sort of things operate. You also talk about the value of Black life. I have an interesting perspective. A lot of people say, oh, the valuing of Black life is so low that that's why we see these outcomes. I actually see something different. I see that the valuation of Black life is much higher than people think. It's just oftentimes our brutalized, dead, and labored bodies is where the valuation comes from. For example, when we are incarcerated, we know that there are now private prisons. You can literally purchase stock in these companies on the New York Stock Exchange. That is valuing Black bodies. That comes straight from convict leasing. If we looked after slavery, one thing that happened after slavery is that convict leasing took off. It was known as slavery by a different name. And in the state of Alabama, 75% of the state revenue came from convict leasing. That was just slavery by a different name. We are seeing that today, even at our universities, where we go to certain places and you flip up a desk and you actually see that it was made by a company that has people in prison making it. So, we see these type of outcomes. And then, essentially you're highlighting a dichotomy that I appreciate between reformers and abolitionists. The way I feel, sometimes I don't know how much more explicit I can say about digging up the rotten trees, but I also know while we're digging them up, I also think there is something about sitting at a table to have a conversation, because one thing Shirley Chisholm and John Lewis taught us, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu and someone's eating us for lunch. And I've been sat at too many tables where I was the only one saying these things. And I wanted to be at those tables to speak for people who thought like me and who looked like me, who were continuously being rolled into the ground by people who didn't have our best interests at heart.
That's so remarkable. Thank you for that. And I also want to lift up how courageous that is, because it's uncomfortable. I'll say it's uncomfortable for me. I have sat with RPs and wardens and DAs and all of that. It's a mantle to carry, so Thank you for carrying that flag, and thank you for responding to my questions. I always want to prioritize students first. So I'm going to start with, let's see. Ratika Cutman is a first-year student here at UC Berkeley, and she asked, many Americans think the problem is with the apple, not the tree. How do we change this ideology? And do you think you're on the right track to changing it? And I love this especially because I'm thinking about police officers, patrol officers, they follow orders, right? we can talk about sort of the toolkit that they rely on to de-escalate or diffuse or protect and all these sorts of things in the names of public safety and public health. But ultimately, they're mobilized by a public. Amy Cooper knew exactly what to say. She knew exactly what to say. That man could have died, and many do in those situations, So we have a responsibility to confront as well. And that's everybody. Our colleague James Foreman Jr. writes about how the Black middle class was all for regulating poor Blacks in Harlem and elsewhere, in New York and around the country. So we all have a responsibility to think about how are we mobilizing police and to further which interests. So Rashawn, would you please speak to Rakita's question about what are we going to do about the ideology and what kinds of movements can we make to get people to shape up and stop mobilizing police officers?
I think you just nailed it. I think you just answered it. Working with, I really don't think people understand, and you just highlighted this, I really don't think people understand how difficult it is to work with police officers. And I should say I have several police officers in my family. I come from a police officer family.
Two COs in my family.
Yeah, it didn't super prepare me for these sort of things because they are a very, very sensitive group of people. And they are a very empowered group of people. And one thing we know is that people don't give up power easily. So for a lot of people, equity feels like marginalization when you've been privileged. And we have to understand that we are in a reorganization as it relates to law enforcement. So yeah, I do think I'm on the right track because it's evidence-based and it's data-driven. But part of highlighting this is where do we hit them at? My research has led me that we deal with civilian payouts for police misconduct because right now they have a lack of accountability. What do I mean by that? Who pays these payouts? Not only that graphic where I showed where it's a large percentage of people who are a large percentage of people who are getting payouts. That money doesn't even come from the police budget. So on top of the police budget, other money, these monies for civilian payouts come out of the general funds. Money that's going to be going toward parks, money that's going toward social services, money that's going toward schools, money that's going toward work infrastructure for somebody being killed by the police. If we do something about that, put a cap and say that a police department insurance policy has to pay for it, that money comes out of the police department budget, that then gives the police chief the ability to say, Derek Chauvin, you've cost us X millions of dollars over the past 5 years. We can no longer afford to keep you here. Now, all of a sudden, we have to let you go because from a market-driven approach, yes, they are costing us too much money. And once people start realizing that, and it's starting to happen, once people start realizing that, that's going to be a big thing. As an example, the state of Virginia, I testified in the state of Virginia last month. They voted last week on qualified immunity. Now, it didn't pass. But for anybody who's in the policy space knows that first, second time, a lot of things don't pass. But the fact that the state of Virginia is voting on Virginia? Look, I'm from Tennessee. Virginia is not California, right? It's not even like the parts where you get outside of Oakland and Berkeley and you up in the field somewhere in the desert in California. It's not even like that. We're talking about Virginia. The state legislature voted on qualified immunity. This tells you where we're moving to. And I'm going to tell people the pivotal point. We are at a juncture where and regardless how people feel about this, we can have this conversation too. But just on the surface, the two candidates is running for president, that if Joe Biden wins and 4 to 6 Senate seats flip, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act becomes law. It is one of the most progressive and transformative pieces of legislation on police reform that has ever existed. And that is what I think we should be focusing on. The House of Representatives passed that legislation on what would have been Tamir Rice's 18th birthday, symbolically. And now they're like, people, y'all won't change on policing? Do your part, put the right people in office, and we will make this legislation law. And everything that I basically had on that list instantly becomes law across the country.
That's beautiful. I think about that too. My work stems from a legal epidemiological framework, which essentially suggests codified law, legal institutions, how they work, personnel in those spaces, can be directly connected to health outcomes. And in this particular space, the criminal legal system for health outcomes. And so thank you for lifting that up too, is there's movement in a lot of different spaces that looks good. I'm still cynical, but I will fight that fight with folks because I'll take it. You know, this is sort of where we're at because people are falling in the interim. Thank you for that question, Rakita. I want to pose Laisha Maciel's question, particularly, Rashawn, because you showed us that great data with social media. And what I love too about the virtual world is it allows for wider engagement. You know, like you and I both work outside of the ivory tower, as do a number of people on this call. And I think it's important, particularly as members of public institutions, to educate the public, you know. So these sorts of our engagement in social media and Twitter, and also bringing data from those spaces as sources of truth, right, that are valid and things like that that aren't dismissed, I really, really appreciate it because we're moving more and more into a space where we can be in conversation with others. With that also comes the surfacing beneath the tip of the iceberg of some really, really ugly ideas, you know, and recruitment and socialization and indoctrination of white supremacy, you know. So I'm thinking a lot about everyone's talking, but everyone's not talking about the things or lifting up the things that are good for racial equity. So this question really speaks to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts from Laisha. Laisha asked, do you actually believe that social media has caused more segregation and isolation than unification?
Yes, most definitely. So social media is a gift and a curse. There's a graphic that I would have typically showed, but I removed it, but it shows political polarization over time. And see, this is the interesting thing about social media. Social media simply reflects back the world that we give it. So what social media is highlighting with political polarization is how politically polarized we already are and how we were even before Obama. There's a graphic from James Moody, who is a sociologist who studies social networks. He's at Duke. And he has this graphic where starting in the mid-90s with Bill Clinton, that was when we started to see Republicans and Democrats go like this in their Senate voting. They just expanded. So social media is a reflection of that. We also know, despite those of us who try and who do live in racially diverse communities, most are not, our neighborhoods today are just as segregated as they were in 1980. Oakland, where I happen to live in Lake Merritt, one of the reasons I live there is because it was one of the only 2% of census tracts in the United States that had a similar percentage of Asians, whites, Latinos, and Black people who have a comparable level of education and income. Only 2% of census tracts. Census tracts are way smaller than zip codes. So it just simply doesn't exist. So social media does do that. But at the same time, it gives voice oftentimes to the voiceless.
That's right.
Social media allows the ability for people to connect with certain people who they otherwise would never be in conversations with. And oftentimes social media puts things out into the open, even if we're in this era of cancel culture that I'm not always comfortable with as things come out and we, you know, rush to judgment and those sort of things. But overall, we see the way that social media is a gift and a curse. But I know one thing, without the social media that we have, just imagine, as I said earlier, if we didn't have these videos of what's happened to people just in 2020 alone. I mean, I think we'd be having this conversation because y'all invited me in the spring, but most of the conversations that people have been having around this topic, they would not be having because social media allows what happens in the dark to come to the light.
That's right. I think about too how you said social media is a gift and a curse. For me, it's really upsetting to see the footage. You know, I've written about body-worn cameras with a lot of skepticism using data from folks living in Baltimore City, not county, city, you know the difference. And they talked about, we've always had footage. We've had CCTV, we've had dash cams. I remember very clearly watching the Rodney King footage. We've had effigies from lynchings, right? Yep. Lynch mobs have kept Black skin as leather and like fashioned purses and things like that, you know? So we've always had these materials, right? And they're circulating. And I think too about how that stuff gets fetishized also, you know? So more visuals also means more pain. And that's something I'm trying to reconcile when I think about transparency and accountability within policing. How much more can I see, you know? And it speaks to your data also, and your studies rather, around indirect harm. You know, especially the stuff that you do with Alias Azul. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for all of that. I'm gonna ask one more question from the Google Doc and then move to the chat because the chat is doing like this. Everybody wants to talk?
to
Yeah, we
you.
do rapid fire. I wanna try to get as many in. I'll be
Likewise, you're such a good sport. Thank you. So this is from Ann Keller, who's in the School of Public Health here. I say here, I'm in Richmond on unceded Wichita land. But here at UC Berkeley, she asked, are there any cities addressing police violence and racism in policing that are getting it right? If so, what are they doing, and what is the potential for those successes to be replicated in other places?
Yeah, I don't really think that it is when it's getting it right, but I can give you piecemeal on where different departments are getting certain things right. So the first big one I think about is Nashville, Tennessee. They have a community oversight board that is roped into the budget. And the person who heads up the community oversight board, her name is Jill, doing a phenomenal job, former police officer from DC, and Jill Verge. And what's interesting about that is the community oversight board has a few things that's important. First, they have access to all data. Second thing, they actually serve on the police misconduct board. They serve on promotional boards. This is where we started to create transparency and equity, because now people can't hide behind closed doors. Because what people have to realize, I really don't think people understand the way that police officers are reprimanded. It's oftentimes other police officers. It's like a jury that makes these decisions. So the Community Oversight Board is doing a good job in Nashville. Check that out. It is the model for people to look at in terms of where they get their funding from. They get their funding from the city, how they're roped in, that sort of thing. Another department who I think is doing an excellent job is Greenbelt in Prince George's County. It's a city in Greenbelt. One of the things that they've done, they've really reinvigorated community policing. And this is the interesting thing. Smaller areas have the ability to do that. Well, mid-sized areas and smaller areas, like officers can be pushed to live in the area. They can do walk patrols. They can do a lot of things that you can't do. We take our virtual reality program and go to high schools in Greenbelt. And we do our virtual reality program with police officers and students together. And it becomes a transformative moment where I remember one time there was a graduating senior at the high school, and he stood up and he said, it's the first time I've ever had a regular conversation with a police officer. Yeah. He said, normally y'all are yelling at me, telling me to get out the street when I'm not doing anything wrong, asking me where I'm going. He said, it's the first time I've just had a regular conversation. And then I loved it because then he said, so look, next time I see y'all, don't act like you don't know me. He was like, don't act like it was one of those moments, right? And so I think they're doing that well. I think that Berkeley and Montgomery County, see, this is the big thing of what I'm trying to get at. The changes that I'm highlighting do not come from police officers. I realized very, very early on, that's not what a change is. And Aaron, you said it earlier. I learned quickly that police officers follow instructions. It is a paramilitary organization. They don't have to agree with what they're doing. They just follow it. So you know what that means? The change comes from the people to the people who we elect to make the changes we want to see. When I talked to Senator Cory Booker a couple weeks ago, he said change doesn't come from Washington, change comes to Washington. That means it comes from the people. And politicians understand that, just like local municipalities do. So in Berkeley and Montgomery County, Maryland, they are reallocating funding, defunding the police. Baltimore has done it, where they have taken money and reallocated. I think that's a good move. We want to be smart about it if we're transitioning with traffic calls and the like. But the point of saying that is we want to look at who we elect at the municipality level and at the state level, the judicial committees at the state level. That is the place where the change is made. Go talk to them, see who's on that committee, tell them the changes you want to see.
I love that. Thank you. I'm not even going to talk more. I'm so excited, but I have to get to the questions. I'm going to be good and not make it just me and you having a drink talking about this stuff. This is so brilliant. So I have from Emily Kurtz. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name. I apologize. But Emily's asking, unfortunately, I currently live in a very conservative pro-police area. I'm very interested in working against FOP, so Fraternal Order of Police contracts. Any recommendations on how I can find and work with others that are interested in this policy-focused work? So I think you spoke to that, but I just want to make sure I asked their question. I feel frustrated and isolated trying to do it on my own. Thanks for any advice and for this amazing session.
Great question. I also want to give a shout out to Caitlin Foltz, who's also a student in Maryland, and Emil Smith, who joined from Maryland as well.
Hi.
So I think when it comes to the fraternal order police, look, I think unions are really, really important. But it's clear that fraternal order police have overstepped their bounds in a lot of different ways. This is the key thing. They have contracts with municipalities, with states, with cities. And where does that money come from? That money comes from you as a taxpayer. So it goes back to connecting with policymakers and saying, we want to see the budget, how much money goes to FOP, how much say they have, and we want to change that. That is really, really important to do. We got to think about it. In Minneapolis, the last thing I'll say about this is I could talk about this all day because it's such a big deal. But in Minneapolis, they were still teaching a warrior style course where the Minneapolis police, despite the fact that the police had banned chokeholds, the police department had put like over a dozen people in chokeholds over the past several years, just choking people out, essentially almost killing people. And then, of course, we know from Rochester to from Eric Garner that people do die from these particular things. So I think the fraternal order police is highly problematic. And let me tell you another reason why, besides the source of the money, which is what I'm telling people to do is follow that source of the money because it's typically your money. The fraternal order police president oftentimes has more power than the police chief. Why? Because the police chief is oftentimes appointed by the mayor or the county executive. The fraternal order police president is voted in by police officers themselves. We have to change the structure of what is happening with the relationship between the fraternal order of police and the police department, which is really the relationship between taxpayers and the fraternal order of police.
That's right. And that's so important because this is what I was talking about with diversifying our way out of this, and that's impossible. And thank you for lifting up Minneapolis as well. Chief Rondo, Medaria Arredondo, is very progressive, and look what happened. Look what happened. You know, it's not just about the PR sort of things. Like it's happening on the ground with officers who often are recruited from spaces that I think are more militaristic, or rather endorsing violence, endorsing white supremacy, endorsing social control and coercion. And, you know, it's echo speak. Like that's an issue sort of culturally within that space. And we can't control that. The FOP is very, very powerful. We have our benevolent sergeants in New York endorsing Trump. That is a big deal.
That is a big deal. And that should be really bipartisan. You know what I mean? It's a huge problem. And to your point about the Minneapolis chief, like 12 to 14 years ago, as you know, Aaron, he sued Minneapolis PD for failure to promote and wrongful discipline. He's not a chief. How much do we think people listen to him?
That's right.
The fraternal order police president has been there for a very long time. This dude be speaking at Trump rallies, to your point.
All the
so, and where do police officers spend their time? At fraternal order police lodges. And look, I'm all for them having a space where they can go because they oftentimes can't do that. But some of these places are like country clubs for real. Yes. And that's where they are having these conversations. The chief is now sitting in an office somewhere being outward facing. The fraternal order police president is sitting there talking to the rank and file every single day.
That's right. Yeah, that's why I always feel badly when I see progressive leadership, because I'm like, this is your PR thing for us. What's happening on the ground is very different with recruitment and socialization. There's a lot of alcoholism, interpersonal violence in these spaces, and they're venting to one another instead of clinicians, you know, and so there's like 9 papers we need to write, Rashawn. So
you just hit the nail on the head. See, this is one of the reasons why I say they need housing subsidies and mental health. A lot of these officers, no matter what city they're living in, they don't live in the community. They're not invested in these communities. We need to mandate that. And I think that a housing subsidy should come along with this, and I'll tell you why. Because this is where, for a lot of people, like I differ with them, but the research I've done suggests these officers are overworked, overstressed, they're underpaid, they're working 60, 80, 100 hours a week. For you all who are tuning in today, think about what happens the weeks you work 100 hours a week. Right. You're short-tempered, you're exhausted, you don't make good decisions. Then let somebody give you a gun and let somebody cut you off in California traffic or DC traffic, because neither one of those places can drive. But just imagine those kind of things and how you react to that.
Yeah.
And then we couple that with the fact that 80% of officers suffer from chronic stress. 90% of them, Aaron, as you just said, never seek clinical help. Yep. We need to mandate that they go get the counseling that they need, because not only do they have implicit biases, but in the framework with so many unknowns and their mental health, their stereotypes go on steroids. That's right. It shouldn't be a surprise why we see the outcomes that we see.
That's right. Thank you for that. I want to lift up Kelly Jones's. Oh, is this our Kelly? Hey, Kelly. Kelly is the rock star behind the scenes who's making.
Oh, what's up, Kelly? Kelly got a question. Kelly has done an excellent job with this, and yes. Christina Mara and everybody else who's helped with this. Thank you all. So, gotta answer Kelly's question. Come on.
Yes.
Kelly's question.
Yeah. Are there technological tools like virtual reality training that can be used to retrain officers so that they have the scripts and scenarios to mitigate implicit biases and stereotyping effects? How do we effectively normalize decency towards Black Americans? And her third question is, through exposure to scenarios that valorize Black life, like, is that a possibility? I know we're running out of time, but I'd love to.
Oh, no, this is a great question, Kelly. Yeah, so I think so. So I think the first big thing is our virtual reality program can be used during the background check. You know, they check for people's mental acuity, like the officer who killed Tamir Rice. He should have never been on the street. Everybody knows it. One of the patterns I'm seeing is that as the numbers for law enforcement decrease, there are people who tried to be police officers 2, 3, 4 times. And I've had cops tell me, yeah, I mean, the third time this person tried, we decided to go ahead and let him in. No, that person's going to kill somebody. And sometimes, and sometimes it's not even that they have biases. Sometimes it's literally that they do not need to be police officers. They are scared people. They just should never have a gun on them. And that happened in Prince George's County with an officer who I got to know very, very well, who shot a person who was in his police car and handcuffed. And so we see these outcomes. So Kelly, yes, I think the background stage is one phase. And maybe it doesn't mean that people don't become cops, even though that could be part of it. But I think it means, to your point, that certain people need additional training. I think the second thing, we can have positive images. I've seen some questions in the chat where someone asked about movies and TVs. Does it play a role? I mean, I think the media plays a role in all of our lives, but I also think that more importantly, the segregation of our lives, the socialization we get coming up in age also more so influences what's going on. Media as a social institution is just one of those factors, in addition to our education spaces, our neighborhoods, our families. So yeah, Kelly, I think that it can be used in that way. And there are some departments who want to do that. I think the other thing is having more positive images. I remember when we were doing our ethnographic observations and we went through an entire training class, and I counted the number of images I've seen of Black people and white people and whether or not they were positive or negative. And overwhelmingly, when Black people were shown, not only was it negative images, but they were doing some of the craziest stuff.
Oh, like, yeah. Jumping out of garbage can. I can't.
Doing like superhuman stuff. Yeah, like, jumping on something, taking off, running, doing a flip. Like, I mean, just stuff that rarely do people do. But if that is the image that law enforcement has, then their response to their interactions at times, that part of what I aim to do as a sociologist is not to justify what people do, but I aim to understand why people do it. And I think I've gotten really good at understanding why police officers do what they do. I don't have to agree with it to understand it, but I think that we can train these sort of things away. And how I know is because officers who are much more experienced, they don't have these same problems.
Right.
It's because they've had enough interactions to say what's going on. But you all know where they mostly work at? They work behind a desk.
That's right.
They're not on the street. And I tell you, if there's an officer that's been a police officer for 20 years and they still work in the same block, either they live on that block and love that street, or they're a horrible cop.
One of the two. Couldn't get out of it.
Yeah, because I mean, you get promoted. Like, who wants to be on the street at 45?
Yeah.
Like, cops don't work like that. It's a young person's profession on the street. So these are things to check in about. Great question, Kelly.
Yeah, and I appreciate that so much with respect to screening and recruitment, you know, and you're recruiting veterans, for instance, who have done tours and again, have not had any sort of the traumas that they bring home with them addressed clinically. We're not screening properly for those things. And also, you know, you can get a jacket, you get your disciplines and things like that and just move around departments. You know, we have in the US, the POST, the Commission on Peace Officer standards and training, and they're very seldom mobilized to really sort of at a national level at that landscape to think about what training should look like. Policing is a local affair, you know, so it's every place is niche, and we sort of have to know who the stakeholders are. We are at 1:29, Rashawn. Do you want one more question? Because I think it's a good one.
Yeah, come on, let's do one more.
Okay, love. So this is a nice one to close out with students and community. From Irene Neri, besides voting and getting the right people in office, what else can we as the public, students, community do, and in a way that avoids performative allyship?
Performative allyship. Okay, so what I'll say to that, and I think this is broadly about systemic racism. So I have a typology that is about what does it mean to really work in these spaces. And I call it the racial equity framework. And people have to transition from being what I call racial equity learners to racial equity advocates to racial equity brokers. A racial equity learner is kind of like what we're doing here. You're learning about a topic that you kind of knew about, or some of you like Aaron already knew about all this stuff. But for the most part, people are learning about a topic. So you learn about it. Then you have to be what I call a racial equity advocate. When I talked about those tables earlier that Shirley Chisholm talked about, when she said, bring a folding chair, all of us sit at different tables. And one of the things that happens at those tables is oftentimes those people look just like us. They have similar demographics of us, similar education level, similar race, oftentimes similar gender, similar ideologies. Part of what that means is that there are other people who aren't sitting at those tables who get talked about and eaten up at that table.
That's right.
You have to be willing to be an advocate to speak up and speak out when you hear people saying something. Because my grandfather, who served 21 years in the military, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, he always says that our silence is our acceptance. That's what he taught me from when I was a kid. Right. Don't be silent. The final thing is to be a racial equity broker. Start to interrogate the places where you experience life. Schools, neighborhoods, places of worship, places where you work, places where you exercise, places where you eat. And look and see whether or not they're diverse or not. And if you're contributing your money and your labor, then you are becoming complicit in the type of segregation and systemic racism that exists in that place. But you can speak up and speak out and do something about it. And policing is the same way. Politicians oftentimes want to hear from their constituents. You can write letters. You can send emails. You can show up at hearings. You can get up and give a 1 to 3 to 5 minute testimony about the change you want to see in your community. And you can also contact the people who represent you federally. Your representatives, your federal senators, your US senators. You can do these sort of things. And we can continue to make a difference in the sort of things that are happening in our lives.
Beautiful. Look, so we ended positive. Can everybody, I know we're on mute, but just give a round of applause to Rashawn Ray, who engaged us so fully and dropped so much knowledge, for which I am so grateful and energized by. This was truly, truly wonderful, especially to kick off the series. So thank you, Rashawn. Do you have any closing words for everybody?
No, just thank you all for being here. I just hope that, people stay safe and healthy. I mean, we're still in a pandemic and life is really, really difficult for people. And, while we can sit up here and be on Zoom and do these sort of things and our lives have changed in some ways, there are other people whose lives have drastically changed.
That's right.
We just want to be conscious of that. But final thing is, if any of your friends are talking about not voting, that's your role to be an advocate, to talk to them about what's going on. And for me, it is the switch in what police reform with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act will mean transformatively for our nation moving forward. And then also tell people it's down ballot. It's not only about voting for the president. Yeah. There's down ballot things happening locally in your community. Look at those candidates and figure out who you want to vote for. And then you know what? If you don't see anybody who looks like you and who represents you, the next election, that means that should probably be you.
I would never pass the vetting. I love you. I love this. Thank you so, so much, everyone. I hope I see you again for the next round. Thank you. Stay safe. Wash your hands. Lead with love. We'll see you soon. You got us, Kelly? Okay. I'll hang back.
Yeah, we are good. Thank you so much. That was just so wonderful.
Did we lose Rashawn? I don't see him anymore. I
I
know he
don't
got
see
hard
him.
stop.
Let's stop recording.